So, good evening members and guests. Welcome to the Book Club of California at the historic Blinn House in Pasadena. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight. For those of you that might be new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with a particular focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books, and we host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs both in San Francisco and here in Southern California on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. If you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed, I strongly encourage you to consider membership. Our dues are modest, and the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online, visit us at bccbooks.org. Now, in addition to supporting fine printing and the book arts, the book club has, since its founding, been an important advocate for scholarship in and the appreciation for the history of California and the West. And that aspect of our mission remains very much alive to this day. Tonight, the book club presents the 5th Kenneth Karmiole Endowed Lecture on the history of the book trade in California and the West. I'd like to introduce the Vice President of the book club's Board of Directors, Daria Tapusis, and she will acknowledge the generous benefactor of this important lecture, and she will introduce our speaker. Daria?
Thank you, Kevin. Hopefully you can all hear me. I am not Kevin's height or David's height, so. Yeah, I don't want to adjust anything.
You're good.
I'm good, okay. Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to have you here. I am Daria Tapusis. I'm the co-vice president of the book club's board of directors. On behalf of the board and our members, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the 5th Kenneth Karmiole Endowed Lecture on the history of the book trade in California and the West. This perpetual lecture series has been made possible through the extraordinary generosity of longtime book club member and my fellow book club of California board director, Mr. Kenneth Karmiole. Ken is not only a respected member of the antiquarian bookselling community, having been the founder and president of Kenneth Karmiole Bookseller since 1975, but he has also been one of California's most active and generous supporters of academic libraries and of the bibliophile community. Ken has established multiple endowments for the purchase of rare books, research, lectures, archival studies, and students at Rare Book School at the University of Virginia and at his alma maters, UC Santa Barbara and UCLA. Ken has served 3 terms on the National Board of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America and received the Distinguished Alumni Award for 2011 from the UCLA Library and Information Studies Alumni Association. For those of you who know Ken, you know how passionate he is about books, and I just love being able to interact with Ken, and I'm just so lucky to have been on the board with him, so thank you, Ken. The Book Club of California, future scholars and bibliophiles everywhere benefit from his generosity in establishing this perpetual lecture series. Please join me in thanking Ken for his extraordinary support. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest lecturer who will speak to us about bookseller and publisher Paul Elder and his legacy as a Bay Area bookman. Our speaker is David Mostardi, a book collector, curator, and historian who bought his first Paul Elder book, The Art of the Exposition, in 1994, and is widely known as the leading expert on the San Francisco bookseller and publisher Paul Elder. His checklist of the publications of Paul Elder was first published in 1999, and the online version of the checklist debuted in early 2012. David curated a popular exhibition at the San Francisco Public Library in 2004. It was titled The Best in Books and Art, Paul Elder and Company, 1898 to 1968. David received his BA from the University of California, Berkeley, works as an engineer with Palo Alto Networks, and served as the club historian for the Hillside Club, an organization that supports the arts and culture and preserves a landmark building in Berkeley. Since 1980, he has been playing Scottish, English, and international dance music, chiefly on accordion. Hopefully we'll invite him back just to play the accordion. His subject is the bookseller and publisher Paul Elder. In August 1897, a young Paul Elder resigned his sales position at William Doxey's bookstore in San Francisco's famous Palace Hotel and opened his own shop 2 blocks away. Thus began a family bookselling and publishing business that lasted until 1968. Elder's goal was a bookstore with a carefully crafted ambiance reflecting his embrace of the California arts and crafts movement. Tonight, David Mostardi will present a photographic tour of Elder's San Francisco bookstores as he persevered through the 1906 earthquake and fire, did his part to rebuild downtown, and celebrated the grand festival of the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to David Mostardi.
Thank you, Daria, for that kind introduction. I consider it a great honor and privilege to speak here at the Book Club of California. And I want to apologize in advance before we get started. I'm just getting over a head cold, so if you hear me coughing tonight, it's because of that. It's not COVID. 27 years ago, almost 28 years ago, I attended my very first antiquarian book fair in San Francisco. And all these old books, I thought, well, this is fun. And that evening, I purchased this book, Typologia by the famous type designer Frederick Gowdy. And I bought this book from someone named Kenneth Karmiole. So the fact that 28 years later I'm standing here giving the Kenneth Karmiole Endowed lecture, as my mother would have said, I am tickled pink. I want to start by acknowledging 3 important women without whose work and support I would not be standing here. In 1977, Ruth Gordon wrote her PhD thesis on Paul Elder at UC Berkeley. It is still, to this day, the only full-length work on Elder. It has been an invaluable reference to me, and Ruth's work is in every way the foundation of mine. Sadly, Ruth passed away in 2016. This was our only meeting in 2004. My gratitude also goes to Jean Rogers, Paul Elder's granddaughter. For many years now, Jean has cheerfully given me access to her family's archive of books and photographs and ephemera, and many of the photos you'll see tonight are from her collection. And Jean and her daughter Meg were at the talk on Monday night in San Francisco. Jean is almost 93 years old now. And lastly, my love and affection for my wife Arlene Baxter, who is here tonight and who has endured Paul Elder this and Paul Elder that for 30 years now. So thank you very, very much, dear. And before you leave tonight, please pick up a keepsake printed by Andre Chavez at the Clinker Press in Portland, Oregon.
Formerly
Yes, formerly here in Passage. In 1903, the noted Congregationalist theologian and author Lyman J. Abbott visited San Francisco. He edited a magazine called The Outlook, and his own editorial column in the magazine was called Impressions of a Careless Traveler. So in one of his columns, Abbott wrote, "One of the most attractive art stores I have ever visited, possessing a great variety of art articles, is that of Mr. Vickery, of national reputation, and not the largest, but certainly the most artistic and charming bookstore I have ever seen, east or west, in America or Europe, is the bookstore of Paul Elder, adjoining. They have furnished conclusive evidence that there is a large, cultivated constituency, both artistic and literary, in and about the city of San Francisco. Well, what was it about Paul Elder's bookstore that prompted Lyman Abbott to write these gushing words? So that's what I want to show you tonight, and we'll see a few books too. So, David Paul Elder was born on New Year's Day in 1872 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. His given name was David. Family moved to San Jose, California when Paul was just a toddler. When he was about 8, they moved up to San Francisco, where he later attended Lowell High School. In 1889, Paul gets his first real job as a clerk at Wells Fargo Bank. He's only 17 years old at this point, and there's no record of him ever graduating from Lowell. So the simplest explanation is that Paul left school early to get a job to help support the family. His father, Scott, had held a whole series of different jobs in the 1880s and 90s, and the family moved around a lot. So it's likely that money was always a problem. And the first key moment happens in 1890 when Elder gets the job that sets him on his career path. He lands a sales job at the bookstore of William Doxey. And Doxey's bookstore was in the Palace Hotel. The biggest, most elegant, the swankiest hotel in town. And in 1890 San Francisco, 1890s literary San Francisco, Doxey's bookshop was the place to be. Here's where Doxey's shop was located, just a few doors from the hotel entrance on Market Street. The foot traffic at this location would have been tremendous, despite the clean sidewalks you see in the photograph. So here's what the inside of Doxey's looked like. This is a nighttime shop, but it looks kind of like you would expect a bookstore to look like. Books, books, and more books. You can see that there's a balcony level upstairs with more books, and there's also a lower level with more books, but also in center, a 20-year-old Paul Elder pretending to be a customer. So Elder spent 7 years working for Doxey, and during that time he watched and he learned. So Doxey sold books, but Doxey also published books, and Elder would go on to do that both of those very successfully. Doxey cultivated local authors, and he turned his shop into something of a hub for San Francisco literati. And Doxey marketed his product in innovative new ways. For example, Doxey is credited with inventing the single subject display window. So here's one such window in 1895, Literature of the Decadence, a play on the word decade. There are lots of juicy things in this window, but I will highlight 2 of them. At bottom right are issues number 1 and 2 of The Lark, which you may be familiar with, a very mauve decade bohemian publication. And then in the upper left, a poster for The Lark magazine by Florence Lundborg. In 1897, Elder was ready to strike out on his own. He was 25 years old now, and he certainly wanted to become more than just a salesman in somebody else's bookshop, especially since the previous year he had married this lady, Emma Moore. Elder may have also been nervous about the state of Doxey's finances, and indeed, Doxey went bankrupt 2 years later. So in 1897, Elder quit Doxey, and he walked 3 blocks up Montgomery Street to this building, the Mills Building, which is still there. And he opened his own business working out of this room in the mezzanine. This is a big step down from a street-level bookshop with lots of pedestrian traffic in the Palace Hotel. On the other hand, it was his own business. But he wasn't in this room for very long because of this man, Morgan Shepherd. Elder had met Shepherd while he was at Doxey's. In June 1898, they went into partnership together as Elder and So let's talk about Morgan Shepherd for a few minutes. To any biographer, Morgan Shepherd would be a far more interesting subject than Paul Elder. Now, I don't like to call Elder boring, but Elder was very private. He was very reserved. He was very businesslike. He didn't talk about himself to anybody, so we don't know much about him. But he was happily married, he had 3 children, he commuted to San Francisco every day from his home in Berkeley. Morgan Shepherd, on the other hand, let me count the ways. So, Shepherd was born in 1865 in Brooklyn, New York. He was born the day before Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, ending the Civil War. He loved his mother dearly, but she died when he was 10, and his teenage years were not happy, and he learned how to settle many disputes with fistfights. As a young adult, he and his friend Bob decided they would go on an adventure to Peru. So they got on a boat, and they went south, and on the boat, Morgan fell in love with a young lady. And Bob didn't like that because Bob was an observant Christian and didn't think that Morgan should give in to lust. Well, characteristically, Morgan and Bob decided to settle things with a fist fight. If Morgan won, he would get to follow his new paramour to Lima, Peru. If Bob won, then they would exchange their tickets and go north to California. Well, Morgan lost the fist fight. So he reluctantly said goodbye to his new lady friend, and they got tickets to California. But Morgan quickly got tired of Bob, and so impulsively he got off the boat in what is now El Salvador, in a town called Acajutla, where there was a conflict going on over a silver mine, and so Morgan decided to get involved with this. There were 2 factions, the government over here and the rebels, captained by this rebel general. Morgan joined the rebels. And he was in a bunch of skirmishes, including one where he got stabbed in the shoulder and somehow did not die of infection. And then a couple weeks later, with a rifle in his hands, he shot and he killed somebody. Well, that got him really scared, so he hightailed it back down to port, got on the steamer again, north to San Francisco, and when he finally arrived, he had a whole succession of jobs in the Bay Area. First, he invested $200-300 in a gelatine photogravure process, which did not work out, so he quit. Then he worked at a vineyard in Livermore, and he quit. He was in an apricot orchard in Sacramento, and he got fired. He was a surveyor's chain boy in Napa Valley, and he quit. And finally, back in the city, he was a trolley car operator, but he got fired for giving free rides to kids. All of this, and he is still only 23 years old. This kind of story is a goldmine for any kind of biographer. In contrast, Paul Elder never shot and killed anybody. So finally, Morgan Shepherd spent 10 years as a clerk at Bank of California, which he hated. And that's where he was working when he met Paul Elder. And they opened this bookstore. So let's take a look at this bookstore they opened. This was the block it was on. If you know San Francisco at all and know where the famous Gump's store is, that's where this bookstore was. This is the store that Lyman Abbott gushed about so much in 1903. This is the northwest corner of Post and Grant, and the bookstore is located right here, just agonizingly out of frame. I've been looking for years for a photograph of the exterior of this bookstore. If you have a picture of that, you will be my friend for life. So let's look at the inside. So this is the main book room at Elder and Shepherd. Now, at first glance, this looks very much like the inside of Doxey's bookshop, right? Books, books, and more books. There are 2 bookshelves at the end, and there's a gap in the middle. If we walk through that gap, we're here in the rare book room. In the first, say, half of Elder's long career, he was a well-known antiquarian and book dealer. He was very proud of that. Let's turn a corner now and walk into the central art room. So this is the photo I teased you with a little earlier. Suddenly, this doesn't look so much like a bookstore anymore. Yes, there are some books in the cases, But we also see, for example, some copper bookends in that central bookcase. There's arts and crafts pottery on the table in front, and there's a small painting so close to the floor that you can kick it with your shoes. Off to the right, there's another table with some very nice looking pottery on it, and a large painting on the wall, maybe by William Keith, whose work Elder is known to have sold. Here's another art room, more pottery, more paintings, no books whatsoever. And finally, the children's book room. This is the children's book room.
Oh my God.
The books are all for youngsters, but everything else, from these Art Nouveau lumpy light fixtures hanging from the ceiling, or the pottery on that table to the left, or pottery on this table, or the prints and the paintings and the Chinese lantern hanging from the skylight, everything else is very much for adults. If my mother had taken me into this room, she would have said, "Don't touch anything." So how did Elder and Shepherd combine to create this innovative bookstore? So I'm going to read you what Shepherd had to say. This is from an autobiographical piece he wrote in 1945 when he was 80 years old. So this is almost 50 years after the fact. In 1898, I made contact with Paul Elder, bookman of San Francisco. I had then married Mary Elliott Putnam, daughter of Saul Putnam and niece of Josiah Whitney. So that's the same Josiah Whitney for whom Mount Whitney is named. I started the firm of Paul Elder and Morgan Shepherd on $2,000 capital of Mary's money, his wife's money, and $2,000 of Elder's book stock. That was in June 1898. So $2,000 in 1898 is about $72,000 today. With the $2,000, I designed and decorated and fitted out a unique shop. I had charge of the art and curio department. I had wide acquaintance with Chinese and Japanese merchants who consigned many treasures. These sold well at outrageous profits. The PE and MS shop became popular with the rich and often vulgar. January 1899 showed big profits. Okay, so Paul Elder brought all the books to the partnership and Shepherd brought all the art. They were two very different men, but they complemented each other well, and they probably felt between the two of them, they had all the talents and experiences they need for this new kind of bookstore. Elder had 7 years experience at Doxey's and a good head for business, and Shepherd was the artist and the designer and the published author. In addition to the unique bookstore, Elder and Shepherd immediately started publishing their own books. So let's take a look at a few of my favorites. Now, if we were all up in San Francisco right now, there would be a whole exhibition that I curated of Elder's books at the Book Club of San Francisco on Center Street. So I can't take you over there. But if you find yourself in San Francisco between now and February 12th, please stop in and see my exhibit. So this is the very first book ever published by Elder and Shepherd, By the Western Sea, poetry by Marshall Ilsley, who is a family friend of Shepherd's wife, Mary. The wraparound cover design and all the lettering is by Morgan Shepherd. Here's the title page, very plain, but the title pages will get nicer very soon. So this is, in my opinion, the most handsome book ever published by Elder and Shepherd, Wayfarers in Italy, travel writing, early travel writing, beautifully bound with vellum spine and very high quality Italian paper. The title page art is probably by Shepherd, and the frontispiece there on the left is a drawing of a town called Ascoli Piceno in the Italian region of Le Marche. So, as it happens, Ascoli is just 20 miles from where my own grandfather was born. And Arlene and I were in Ascoli Piceno last fall, and I was able to find the exact same spot. 120 years later. Great, I love this. I was really happy to find it. the travel writing in this book is great. I mean, it's 120 years old, but to me, it's very, very readable. She does a wonderful job describing the Polly on Sienna. The author, Catherine Hooker, was Morgan Shepherd's sister-in-law, Mary's sister. So we see that Morgan Shepherd was also providing many of the authors that they published. Into the Light, poetry by the future San Francisco mayor, Edward Robeson Taylor. So we see here there are two different cover designs. Elder did this a lot. So here's the title page for Into the Light. And this title page is where tonight's keepsake comes from.
Thank you.
This artwork is all by Morgan Shepherd, very, very Art Nouveau, as is the internal artwork. All nice curves, very French Art Nouveau. Well, the partnership of Elder and Shepherd only lasted for 5 years. The two very different men probably just drove each other nuts. So here's what Shepherd wrote about the breakup, and again, this is 40 years later. Elder was a difficult man. He was a good rare book man, and that's unusual. But curios outsold books, and he didn't like that. And I didn't like Elder's business ethics, so we fought, and he bought me out.
What would have happened?
Well, Shepherd didn't elaborate on his accusation of questionable business ethics. But the picture one gets by reading Shepherd's mini autobiography is of a man who was perpetually angry at the world. He was angry at his mother's early death, and he was angry at his absent father. He was angry at himself for not being a good businessman, and he was angry at all his business partners who kept taking advantage of him. Almost every relationship of Morgan Shepherd seems to have ended badly. There's a whole lot more I could say about Shepherd, but we don't have time. Maybe I'll do a talk on Shepherd one day. Back at the bookstore, though, Paul Elder was now the man in charge. So what used to be Elder and Shepherd was now Paul Elder and Company. And who really knows whether Elder was really angry that curios outsold books? But one thing is for certain, and that's that in addition to books, Elder continued to sell curios and prints and pottery and metalwork for the rest of his career, and they probably all sold at outrageous profits. So Shepherd's departure wasn't the only important change. The 20th Century Press, which had been doing a lot of printing for Elder, became a subsidiary to Paul Elder and Company, and the name was changed to the Tomoye Press, and it became the in-house printer for everything that Elder published. And the man running the press was John Henry Nash, who was one of the founders, one of the co-founders of the Book Club of California in 1912, needs no special introduction from me. Nash was still early in his career, and Elder's wide variety of output gave Nash lots of leeway for experimentation. The Tomoye Press was a really big room with lots of workers and lots of presses and lots of paper. Besides Elder's books, they had all sorts of ephemera to print, such as Impressions, which was Elder's in-house magazine, and broadsides, and calendars, and postcards, and greeting cards, and catalogs. It's a really big operation. So let's take a look at a few of the books from the early years of the Tomoye Press, so starting in 1903. So Morgan Shepherd's artwork came from the world of Art Nouveau. Everything is curves. Paul Elder's artistic sensibility lay in the arts and crafts movement. Straight lines, earth tones, natural materials, connections to the outdoors. And in the case of Yosemite Legends, with artwork by Florence Lindborg, connections to Native American themes. And Lindborg's internal illustrations are very much influenced by the tonalist school of Arthur Wesley Dow. Here is one of the most influential books that Elder ever published, The Simple Home by Charles Keeler, who in 1904, not coincidentally, was president of the Berkeley Hillside Club. So I am the historian at the Berkeley Hillside Club, which we just celebrated our 125th anniversary last month. The Hillside Club was founded by a group of Berkeley women in 1898, primarily to prevent ugly Victorian houses from blemishing the otherwise unspoiled Berkeley Hills. But if you're not going to build an ugly Victorian house, what kind of house do you build? Well, you build an arts and crafts house, that's what you do. And that's what this book is about, describing the kind of arts and crafts house you should build. The Simple Home became something of a manifesto for the Hillside Club, a snapshot of the California expression of the arts and crafts movement. If I had to pick one book as a good candidate for the role of the prototypical Paul Elder book, this would be a good choice. The Garden Book from 1906. Multiple cover options, each featuring different botanical designs. Beautiful decorations both on the title page and every text page by Spencer Wright, who is one of Elder's favorite artists. An out in nature theme consistent with the arts and crafts movement. Liberal use of a black letter typeface and deliberate archaic spellings, both suggesting Old England. And text not composed of prose, but collected quotations, which is something Elder used again and again. They must have sold well because he kept doing it. And finally, liberal use of one of John Henry Nash's trademarks, the mitered rule. Each big box and each little box is bounded by very precise double lines, very perpendicular. This is really difficult to do with letterpress printing, and Nash was expert at it. Now, if we go back and compare the Garden Book with Morgan Shepherd's design for Into the Light, so these two books were only published 4 years apart. And they both have text enclosed in a box, but how the two different artists approached it, from Art Nouveau on one side and arts and crafts on the other, very different. Both using forms from the natural world. Well, things were going so well that Elder, through his Southern California connections that he got through Morgan Shepherd, decided to open a satellite bookstore in Santa Barbara on Chapala Street. So Elder was right where he wanted to be at this point. His bookstores were successful, his publications were popular, and his curios were selling at outrageous profits. Back home in Berkeley, his third child was just born. Life was good. And then, early one fateful April morning, this happened. The most famous earthquake in US history. And here's the most famous photograph from the most famous earthquake. Arnold Genta pointed his camera down Sacramento Street from Nob Hill. Elder's bookstore is down inside the clouds of smoke, a few blocks over to the right. I've always found this an amazing photograph of the human condition. So you can see that building on the right, the entire front wall fell out onto the street, and there's a piano on the first floor that's ready to also just fall out onto the street. And yet that group of men at right are sitting in chairs, and there's a group of women at left who are just standing, and they're all watching the city burn. They're probably all just in shock, except that it would get worse, because everything, by the next morning, everything in this photograph was gone, burned to the ground. This is the photo I showed you earlier of the block where Eldon Shepherd's bookstore was. This is the same block after the fire. The bookstore, completely gone, total loss. The Tomoye Press, a total loss. These might be the ruins of the bookstore. Here on the left edge, it's really hard to tell with everything gone. Well, what to do now? How to start over from scratch? And it wasn't just Elder, of course. Every bookstore in San Francisco was destroyed. Every printing press in San Francisco was destroyed. Uncertain what would happen next, most vendors of all stripes decided to erect temporary buildings in a temporary shopping area. But that's not the first thing Elder decided to do. Elder published a book. San Francisco, the Earthquake and Fire, was issued just 2 months after the disaster. Lots of photographs, including this one of the Palace Hotel on fire. And it had a large fold-out frontispiece of the burning city. This book must have been printed elsewhere in the Bay Area because, of course, everything in San Francisco was gone. While he was getting this book produced, Elder made 2 important decisions. First, he would build a new permanent bookstore in San Francisco. And second, he would move the publishing business to New York City. So the temporary shopping area that sprang up in San Francisco was along Van Ness Avenue, which is a fair ways west of downtown. And this is where Elder put his new store. So this is the northwest corner of Van Ness and Bush. And if we look kitty corner from this, the opposite corner, we see Elder's new bookstore. And the architect of this store was none other than Bernard Maybeck, whom Elder probably met through Charles Keeler. So of all the bookstores that I'm going to show you tonight, this one is my favorite. From the wooden sign hanging out front, to the massive beams and the peaked ceilings and the medieval chandeliers and the oak tables and bookcases. I want you to remember these chandeliers and these oak tables. You're going to see them again later. The store was cozy, it was well designed, had all of the rustic, unpainted Maybeck flourishes. I could have lived in this bookstore as my house. Aha! Did I mention that there was an art room? Another medieval chandelier and enough period arts and crafts pottery to make any collector swoon. So, for example, you might like something from this table on the left. That Tico one with the voids up on the left edge is rather nice, but I'm sorry, I have dibs on this dark one here in the lower right-hand corner. Elder left his employee John Howell in charge of this store. It's the same John Howell who later opened his own antiquarian bookstore in San Francisco. He left John Howell in charge of the store, and he and John Henry Nash and their families all moved to New York City. Elder probably figured that if he was going to reboot and his entire printing shop from scratch, he might as well do it in the nerve center of American publishing, which was New York. They set up shop in this building on East 19th Street near Gramercy Park on the 4th floor. No photographs survived, but there was probably a small bookstore there. Unfortunately, Elder and Nash encountered significant logistical problems almost immediately. It turned out that getting things printed in New York was a lot more expensive than it had been in San Francisco. And there were lots of production delays, the result being that most of the holiday gift books weren't ready until after Christmas. And this was a big financial blow. In 1906, the Christmas shopping season was just as big a deal as it is today. And Elder ended up with way too much inventory and not nearly enough sales. Now, in fact, Elder had accomplished a remarkable thing. In just 9 months, he had moved his business clear across the country, restarted it from scratch, and published 15 books, all the while maintaining this new store out on Van Ness Avenue. But because he missed Christmas, it caused a severe cash shortage in 1907. The problem then was there was a financial panic in 1907. So for Christmas of 1907, most people were not in the mood to splurge on gift books. Nevertheless, there were many fine publications issued during the New York years, And the most memorable, in my opinion, is this set of 4 books called the Western Classics. So if we use a typical definition of the phrase fine press, what the book club itself promotes, right? The finest in paper and ink and typography and design and artwork and binding. Under that definition, a lot of Paul Elder's output doesn't qualify as fine press. Now, there are well-documented reasons for this. Elder only rarely splurged on production, and John Henry Nash often chafed under what he felt were draconian budgets for each book. And it's a testament to Nash's skill that Elders are made as well as they are. But the Western Classics, we can call these fine press. So Elder splurged on these. A small series of 4 books, they're only about this big. Classic examples of Nash's technique, including, as we see here, the mitered rules, those perpendicular names. Each book has its own color binding, its own design, its own typeface. The books from Elder's New York years are easy to distinguish because the title page will say Paul Elder and Company, San Francisco and New York. It was 1906 to 1909. And even better, the Western Classics are fine literature, worth reading. But by 1909, Elder could no longer sustain his presence in New York. Way too many creditors, not nearly enough cash, way too much inventory. And on top of that, back home he had taken out a new lease on a new building, and that's because it was clear that by 1909, everybody was going to be moving back into downtown San Francisco, which had been rebuilt. So by February of '09, Elder and Nash were back in San Francisco for good. So here's the photo you saw earlier. Elder and Nash were back just in time to open the new bookstore. So that tall building in the middle had just been built before the fire, and then it got burnt out, but the shell was saved, and it's called the Shreve building. The ruins of the old building were here on the left, and he leased a brand new building just around the corner on Grant Street. And here's the main book room in the new building, and what a room it was. Combination main floor and mezzanine, designed once again by Bernard Maybeck. This is a room that the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper gushed over, saying, while it is a store, it has about the same degree of commercial appearance as a Gothic cathedral. So now if we go back to what Elder and Shepard were trying to do in 1898, 10 years earlier, Paul Elder is still trying to do that. Lots of books, yes, lots of books. But lots of other things too. Curios that sold at outrageous profits, but all displayed in a carefully controlled ambience. Nothing that looks remotely like a cash register or a sales till. If you wanted to buy something, you would hand your book or curio to a clerk who would disappear into the back room and then bring out your carefully wrapped item. Paul Elder himself was hardly ever on the sales floor. This is not one photograph, it's 2 that I've stitched together because I wanted you to get a sense of what an amazing room this was. I mean, everyone was trying to revitalize downtown. It was brand new because it had been all gone. And what a reason to come down to the brand new downtown to shop in a room like this. You may have noticed the chandeliers. This is the same chandelier from the Van Ness store that was brought to Grant Street from Van Ness. And if you're familiar with Berkeley at all, this wooden screen here up on the mezzanine and this wooden screen here in the wall may strike you as familiar because it looks like Bernard Maybeck's First Church of Christ Scientist from 1910. That's not a coincidence. There were other rooms here at the store. There was a standard author's room in the basement and the children's room on the second floor. Did I mention that there's an art room? Paintings and silver and copper and pottery and rugs and furniture and mirrors and one of Maybeck's chandeliers that was brought over from Grant Street. And then this table in the middle, a complete assortment of rookwood pottery, including this really nice display tile over on the right. Well, 2 years later, in 1911, Paul Elder and John Henry Nash had a very acrimonious divorce. Nash finally got tired of having such tiny budgets to work with because he wanted to do the kind of printing that he really wanted to do. Elder and Nash were not on speaking terms for many years afterwards. Elder had hired several other printers afterwards, but it wasn't the same. None of them were in Nash's league. And it's easy to tell by looking at the books. The typography and other details just isn't quite the same. And as you know, Nash went on to have quite an illustrious career about which much has been written. In 1915, San Francisco threw a big party called the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. Now, ostensibly, the fair was to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal. But in reality, everybody really knew that what the fair was about was that San Francisco was back. San Francisco had recovered from the earthquake and fire of 1906. And Paul Elder had a booth at the fair. In this building, the Palace of Liberal Arts. Now the fair was immense. It was the entire Marina district of San Francisco. And the buildings were equally immense. Just this one building, the Palace of Liberal Arts, was the size of 4.5 football fields. And Elder's booth was down here at the corner of 2nd Street and Avenue D. The buildings were so big that the aisles had street names. And Elder's booth at the fair was designed by Bernard Maybeck. Now, most people, when they think of the PPIE, they think of the Palace of Fine Arts, which is the only surviving remnant of the fair, even though it's been rebuilt twice. But what people don't know is that Maybeck also designed Paul Elder's booth. And this is what Elder's booth looked like. A tiny Gothic scriptorium that makes you think of nothing more than the big Gothic bookstore back downtown on Grant Street. The swinging gate down here in front looks very much like that double screen on the wall. And this screen up on top looks very much like the screen back at the store in the mezzanine. Not a coincidence. So here's a photo of the booth. And you can see the building, the huge building's ceiling roof way, way up overhead. And here's an enlargement of the sign hanging from the opening. Paul Elder and Company Publishers. So now at this point, Elder's been a bookseller for 18 years, since 1897. But he's not calling himself a bookseller. He's calling himself a publisher. That was his image. That's what was important to him. And publish he did. So Elder issued 13 titles, either directly or indirectly related to the PPIE in San Francisco. Here they all are. The large book at lower left is part of a 2-volume set, the Catalog Deluxe of the Department of Fine Arts, still very collectible. So the good news is that sales at the booth at the PPIE were very high, and several of these titles went into multiple printings. The bad news is that shoplifting was also very high. And so despite the high sales, there were only modest profits. Shoplifting. So every business owner has competition, and Elder was no exception. Much of his competition actually came from the big department stores, because back then department stores had their own book sections. This one, called the White House, was directly across the street on Grant. Actually, this building is still there, but it's been turned into a parking garage. Elder had some money issues before 1906, but he was never able to dig himself out from the money problems caused by the earthquake and fire. I told you earlier how debts had forced him to return from New York, but money problems continued into the teens and years after that. And by 1918, it was clear that publishing books was simply not financially viable for Elder. And so he very reluctantly stopped publishing, and I'm sure that was a very difficult decision to make. As you saw, publishing was his identity. He did publish an occasional book after 1918, but 98% of his output came in the 20-year period between 1898 and 1918. So the current total is 412 titles. In 1921, Elder moved his shop again. After 12 years on Grant Street, he moved around the corner to Post Street, directly across the street from where the first store had been, the one that burned down. He probably moved because the store was bigger, more room for merchandise. The store was at this location for 27 years, longer than any other location. You, the customer, would walk through these front doors and you'd be in modern fiction, and then you'd continue up the stairs to this very pretty landing. And from there we can walk through this opening into the bargain book alcove. Note the same chandelier that was originally Van Ness and then went to Grant Street and then came here to Post. And the screen that was at Grant Street and came here. Or we could have turned into the main book room and note again the heavy oak tables that were at Van Ness Street and then came to Grant Street and then to here. If we go back to that main landing area and look the other way, we see lots of Asian scrolls hanging on the walls and more pottery. And these double doors up here, I am convinced that these are the swinging doors to the 1915 PPIE booth. Did I mention that there was an art room? So it's 1921 now, the arts and crafts movement is starting to fade, but not at Paul Elder and Company. Lots of arts and crafts stuff to get here. Now there was also a gallery space here, lecture and gallery space, the Paul Elder Gallery. Elder used this room a lot for book readings and for exhibitions. You can see there's an exhibit going on now, and musical performances. And here are some of the musicians that would have performed in the space, the Elder Trio. So Paul's wife, Emma, was a skilled pianist, and she saw to it that her 3 children were musicians too. So that's Pauline, the oldest in the middle, on piano, and Scott on the violin at left, and Paul Elder Jr. on cello. Paul Jr. was just about to turn 16 when this photo was taken in 1923. And about 10 years later, in the mid-30s, who shows up working in the bookstore but Paul Elder Jr.? So Paul Sr. is in his 60s now, and he's surely thinking about when he might be able to retire. Despite Paul Jr.'s musical talents, the future of the bookstore lay with him. Years later, he would say that it was a toss-up between music and the bookstore. But the mid-1930s, as you recall, was also the middle of the Great Depression, and Paul probably decided that the bookstore was a better bet than looking around for cello gigs. Paul Sr. eventually did retire, but not until the early 1940s. In Gene Rogers' collection, there are these 2 delightful caricatures of Paul Elder Sr. and John Henry Nash. Both men retired to their Berkeley homes just after they turned 70. Nash had reached out to Elder a few years before to try and settle their old differences, which I hope they did. The 2 men were exact contemporaries. Nash was born 9 months before Elder, and Nash died 8 months before Elder. Here are Paul and Emma at their 50th wedding anniversary. About this time, his health started to fail, and Paul Sr. passed away in 1948 at the age of 76. Which meant that Paul Elder Jr. was now the Paul Elder. And what was the first thing Paul Jr. did? He moved the bookstore just around the corner to Sutter and Stockton. This is Paul and his wife Eloise on the first day of the new store in 1948. No need to climb stairs now at Paul Elder's because there's an elevator. No more unhappy, sweating customers trudging up the stairs. In the new store, they are Romeo and Juliet. What light through yonder window breaks? The contrast between the old store and the new store could not be more pronounced. Goodbye, arts and crafts, and hello, mid-century modern. White walls, white ceilings, white fluorescent lights, everything was different. Now, Paul Jr. did bring along a couple of the Maybach wooden screens and some of the Gothic window decorations, but those are the only visible ties to the old store. If you were wondering what happened to Maybach's medieval chandeliers and those big heavy oak bookcases, the answer is, I don't know. But I fear they may have been discarded. In 1948, nobody wanted arts and crafts. Here again, if you happen to come across these chandeliers or tables, you will be my friend for life. The chandeliers in particular would go very well in my great hall. Paul Jr. continued the tradition of single subject display windows. Here's a 1958 window with a book by Dear Abby, complete with a typewriter. And he still did book readings and even puppet shows. As I mentioned, Paul Elder Sr. retired from publishing in 1918. There were just a handful of books issued after that, and nothing after the mid-30s, except for one last book, The House in Mallorca, published in 1950 with very handsome woodcuts by Millette Dean, who was the subject of the book club's publication in 2018. This book is definitely fine press. And this is the last book ever published by Paul Elder and Company. The end of the line for Paul Elder and Company comes in 1968 when Paul Jr. decides to retire. My wife Eloise and I have been working too hard, too long, he says. They've been at Severn Stockton for 20 years. And the reporter here makes it clear that Elder was not happy with the automated, computerized, and systematized bookselling, not his cup of tea. And he was sharply critical of the new men of publishing and bookselling, the office managers, the men who don't know one book from another or one customer from another. If any of you are booksellers, you can tell me whether anything has changed since 1968. For 70 years, there was a Paul Elder bookstore in San Francisco. It was famous for the ambience and the art objects as for the books themselves. Elder published over 400 titles in his career, many of which are still eagerly collected today. He remained open for business despite the overwhelming calamity of the '06 earthquake and fire, and despite constant struggles with money for years afterwards. But the man himself remains as quiet and enigmatic as he was in life, the polar opposite of his emotional and pugilistic early partner, Morgan Shepherd. I've got lots more on my website at paulelder.org if you're interested. Thank you very much for coming.
Don't go anywhere. We have time for a couple of questions. So we'll start with Ken.
Dave, we know that Paul Elder had an antiquarian department early in his career. Did he continue at all with antiquarian books? Is there any evidence that he did?
There are antiquarian catalogs, at least into the teens, I would say. One of the photos I showed you earlier, I don't know exactly when he stopped. It may, as we know, John Howell, his employee, started his own bookshop, so there may have been here we go.
So there are published antiquarian catalogs?
There are, yes.
I know that there are catalogs that was publications and all that. But
There
those
are some elder catalogs where he lists antiquarian stuff.
Okay, thank you.
So this is the rare book room I showed you earlier. So if we zero in on the table, there's this big heavy book on the table. That book is this book, History of the Will in 5 books by Sir Walter Raleigh from, when is it, 1687. So this is the book that Elder chose for photo shoot day in about 1903. So,
Where are his archives?
where are his archives? Well, of course, a lot of stuff was destroyed in 1906. His granddaughter Jean she has shared a lot of things with me over the past 30 years. There are some financial records which are part of her archives from the teens that I've looked through. There's not too much. I've collected some of them myself. Jean has a fair bit. It's, aside from those 2 bits, it's kind of scraps.
So he didn't put them at
He didn't donate a big pile of stuff to the Bancroft Library or anything like that. Right? Yeah, it's been a detective story. Yeah.
Elizabeth.
I may be one of the few people here who was actually in a Paul Elder bookstore in my childhood in
Wonderful.
the 40s. If we went downtown to Union Square to go to the children's dentist or go to the department stores around Union Square, we would step into Paul Elder
Oh, that's
bookstore.
wonderful.
In my childhood, and I left San Francisco in '53.
Was this before 1948 or after 1948 that you would have been in this store?
Before 48.
Okay, then you would have been in the Post Street store. Yeah. Oh, that's
And so-
wonderful.
And I'm wondering if you came across any interactions between Paul Elder and the Dawsons of Los Angeles? Were they friends?
I don't know of any interaction. Yeah, I have no evidence one way or the other. I should probably
Yeah.
repeat the question. The question was whether there was any interaction with the Dawsons, and I apologize for not repeating earlier questions. And I know of no interaction yet.
We'll take 1 or 2 more. Go ahead.
Yeah, did you show us an interior photograph of Bookstore 3½?
Is that the one in New York?
Yeah.
There are no surviving photographs. Of
That's
the New
just
York,
the outside,
of
right?
the New York. All I know is the outside. Yeah.
A couple of questions. The Grant Street building, is that building still there?
Aha! Thank
You're
you.
cutting to the end. Perfect segue.
Thank you for.
We have some slides at the end which will tell you what all of the locations might look like now.
Second question, is there a bibliography of his publications?
Yes. Please, a checklist.
So, for a long time, I considered writing a formal bibliographic treatise to Paul Elder. I had a day job all these years. I am right on the cusp of actually retiring, so I don't. Such a bibliography may or may not appear. The closest thing is my website, paulelder.org. So please visit. Let me know what you think.
And your checklist.
Well, yes, I published a checklist in 2004 was the most recent publication. It's pretty out of date now because I've discovered a lot more things since then. If you have a 2004 checklist, then there is a list of addenda and core agenda on the website for the checklist. Let me run through the locations. So this was his original 1898, his original location. This building was also burned out in the fire and a new interior rebuilt. This is the old Gump store, and now again the current Gump store, even though Gump's is only on that right-hand third. So this is where the store that burned down in the fire would have been. Here is the Van Ness and Bush store, the one while downtown was being rebuilt. Here's what that corner looks like today. That's so very interesting. You asked about Grant Street in particular. So here are the 2 buildings. That's a Campton Place alley on the left and Tillman Place on the right. If you may remember a store called Tillman Place Books. That's Tillman Place on the right. Bookstore was over on the right. So we have these identical twin sister buildings. Elder's shop was on the right-hand side behind where that white truck is. This picture was from the 50s, I mean, many years later. About 1960, the owner of the building on the right added a 6th floor, and then for some reason decided to take off all the characteristic fascia on this building, and that's why these two buildings today look like this. So they used to be twin sisters, and they're not anymore. But Elder's bookstore was on the right, and that next to where that person was standing. The Post Street store that you were in as a child, this is on the left is what it looked like in 2003. On the right is what it looks like today. It's a diamond store now. It's been remodeled many times, right? There's nothing from when Elder had his store here. And this was the Sutter and Stockton location on the corner, and this is what that corner looks like today. It's the Grand Hyatt Union Square Hotel. That building there at the corner is very tall. And then during these Sutter and Stockton years, there was a small satellite store for the financial district back here in the Mills building on a retail location on Montgomery Street right down here. And that is all of the locations.
Jen, last question.
So you mentioned early on that his wife provided the seed money, right?
Morgan Shepherd's wife, when Elder and Shepherd went into partnership together, Elder brought $2,000 worth of books. I don't know where Elder got that money.
Okay.
And Morgan brought $2,000 of his wife's money, and that's what he bought all the art objects with.
Okay. Do you know what role Elder's wife played in the business?
Because they were so private, I don't know what. I have some stories about Paul Elder's wife after Paul died. Jean told me, for example, that Emma kind of loosened up a little bit. I mean, she was almost 80 years old, but she started smoking, for example. And she probably did a few other things that Elder would have frowned upon back when they were married, but so that's what I know about Emma.
Well, and that's all we have time for, so. And on behalf of the Book Club of California, I want to thank our speaker, and I want to thank you for joining us here this evening. I hope you'll join us for another Book Club of California program, either in person or online. We're usually here in Pasadena on the second Wednesday of every month for an in-person program in Southern California. And you can register for all of our programs online at bccbooks.org or in any of the emails that you might be getting from the Book Club of California. So thanks again. It's great to see everyone. We hope to see you at another book club event soon. Have a great night.